By 1915, the British Army found itself in action against the Turkish Army of the Ottoman Empire, Germany's ally. The Turkish soldier was a brave and formidable enemy, but he was also known for his brutality and extremely harsh treatment of prisoners of war. For the citizen soldiers of Britain's new army, being sent to Palestine or Iraq, then called Mesopotamia, was a daunting prospect. Harold Judd was one of the last survivors of that little-known campaign. Although 100 years old when interviewed, his clear recollection of fighting the Turks is extraordinary. Harold served in the 2nd Battalion of the London Scottish Regiment, the famous territorial army unit, which recruited from Scots who lived in London, or from those who could prove Scots ancestry.
On the Friday night, before the London Scottish were in action, I went down to meet my dad at the station. Yeah, I went every Friday night, and the placards from the papers said the London Scottish in action. And then, of course, the next day there's a full story about the rough time they'd had. And from then on, could I hear anything about the London Scottish, I wanted to know about it. Well, then, of course, I was getting now time to be called up. Well, I didn't want to be called up. I'd like to volunteer. So I went along to the Scottish. And the sergeant said, well, how old are you? So I said, 17, nearly 18. He said, well, it's a bit young. He said, anyway, walk round that veranda. He said, then tell me how long it took you to get round. So when I came back, I said, it took 2 years. Well, he said, 19, right. Well, then, of course, the great day arrived when the draft, there was about 20 or 30 of us, had to go down to Winchester, to where the battalion was. Because when down there, and the Pipers met us at the station and took us up to Hasely Down camp. And, of course, we had a meal and quite a good time. And then we were told we parade at 9 o'clock and got to be nice and smart and clean, and the regimental sergeant major was going to talk to us. And I can remember now, I'm Regimental Sergeant Major Danson. And when you do as I tell you, you're all right. If you don't do as you're told, you're up against it. And if you're up against it, you're up against the British Army. Well, anyway, I had 9 weeks training. That's all. And I never fired a rifle before I went abroad. We had just a rifle with Morris tube in, fired at .22. Never fired ball cartridge until I was on the battlefield. Well, we were inoculated against everything. Yellow fever, black fever, tetanus, cholera, any Asian or Eastern illness we were inoculated against before we left England. I had 10 inoculations. I joined the regiment on Sinai Desert, and then we had about 6 or 8 weeks intensive training, ready for the big attack in the end of October. Well, we had a proper shortly Enfield Mark III style, weighs 7¼ pounds, and it's a dead shot at 800 yards. You didn't kill for the sake of killing. I remember once outside Jerusalem, on one of the 7 hills, there was dozens of men running along a little tiny path cut alongside the foot of the mountains, and we could have popped those off as easy as anything. Only about 300 yards, we could have killed every man jack of them, but we let them go, we didn't kill them. We looked at it this way, he had to. He was forced, he was conscripted. I wasn't. I was a volunteer. Yeah, he had to do that. Whether he wanted to or not, he had to leave his home, go into the army. I didn't. I would have had to eventually, probably. But I had a reserved occupation and I need never have gone. And of course we had the rules and regulations about what we got to do when we get among the enemy, and told us not to interfere with any of their women in the villages because there'd be trouble, and you'd have plenty of trouble without that. And they told us about another lecture on syphilis and that business. We heard that there was some fruit up in this village, and two of us went up to buy it. And the villages they're built so that they're all corners and turns, so they couldn't be easily occupied by enemies. Well, we'd in the meantime, before then, I'd got a bag of Turkish money, not worth much, but a lot of it. And I was bartering for some of this what we were buying. And all of a sudden the man I was with gave me such a shove and the shoulders and pushed me nearly on my backside. And as he did that, a knife came down. It's one of these Turks who were in there, or Arabs in there, and he's just going to knife me for this money.
Initially, the British suffered a series of setbacks at the hands of the Turks. But when General Allenby was appointed commander in 1917, the tide turned. Using new aggressive tactics, the British began defeating the Turkish army in a series of battles.
I was in several big battles, and one I think struck me most is when we took the wells of Sharia, Tel El Sharia. We were getting very, very short of water, and those wells had to be taken. So we started. Then the barrage started, and the Turks barrage. So we were going forward with the two lots of shells, the shrapnel overhead bursting, and the heavy stuff bursting in front of us. And I just looked back, and I could see the whole of the British Army coming forward. There were what we call blobs, half platoons in dots all the way along. And then behind them were companies, 4 platoons. And behind that, the gunners were coming in, manhandling the light 18-pounders. Behind that were the wagons with the ammunition and the food and all the rest of the stuff. And as we advanced, I'd say it get pretty noisy. It's first time in action. And the Colonel, Lieutenant Colonel Ogilvy, he was in the front line with us. He had a revolver in one hand and a fly whisk in the other. And as a man fell beside him, picked up the man's rifle, went forward in the front line with us with rifle and bayonet. And by this time we were getting quite near the Turkish lines, and we were getting machine gun fire then. And the men were dropping all the way around us, some wounded, some killed. Anyway, we got quite near the lines, and our company commander, Captain Robertson, said, "Well, boys, down with them, down with the bayonet, forward with the bayonet." So we went forward, hands with bayonets down. Don't think of anything except to take your objective. That is the main thing a soldier has to do. Your objective is so-and-so. You've got to take it. Well, some fellas couldn't hold their barrels and others couldn't hold their water. But as soon as we went over, we were all right. But it was the suspense of waiting, not knowing. Well, I always wanted to get a quick one and get finished off. I didn't want to come home minus a leg or minus an arm or foot, half a face. I didn't want to come home like that. In the front of the kilt apron there was a little pocket, and there was a little bag with a bandage, iodine, sticking plaster, bandage, and if you could, if I was wounded, you open it up and put the iodine on the wound, whatever it is, and if it's bleeding, try to staunch the blood, putting the pad on and tightening it up, and then wait for the first aid men to come along. He'd do what he could do for you until the medics came, or whether they could cart you away into an ambulance. Of course, the ambulances were all drawn by mules. And I never knew I'd got it until it was at Sharia, Tel El Sharia. And it was only after a time I seemed to get stiff on the leg. And I looked down and my kilt was all with blood. Then when the battle was over and everything's all right, I reported sick, and I was properly dressed and cleaned up, and I went back onto duty. And my parents had a letter from the War Office who regretted to say, your son so-and-so and so-and-so was wounded on such and such a day, but has returned to duty. And I've still got that at home.
In Palestine, Harold Judd took part in the battle for Es-Salt and the capture of Jerusalem. He remembers Private Edward Cruikshank of the London Scottish, who won a Victoria Cross.
We were being shelled by our own artillery, as well as the Turks' artillery, and all the communication lines. We only had telephone wires on the ground, and there was no sun to use heliograph, and Cruikshank volunteered to take a message down to the artillery to tell them to stop shelling us. Well, I think he got 27 bullet wounds. Anyway, we watched him carrying along, falling, carrying along, falling again. And of course, he got the message through and things went all right. And Allenby was so pleased about what he did, he went down to Cairo to see him in hospital, which is most unusual. Well, it took us 4 or 5 days to take Jerusalem. And I looked down upon Jerusalem the night before. By the way, Jerusalem is built on 7 hills. And I looked down and I prayed that I'd live to get into Jerusalem, having come so far. We had to take it with a bayonet because Allenby wouldn't allow gunfire or heavy shells or shells of any description to destroy any of the holy churches and places.
Allenby had deployed his desert army skillfully, forcing the Turks to surrender and the Ottoman Empire to collapse.
It was one of the greatest victories of the British Army in open warfare.